This is an unsolved mystery that may haunt the imaginations of sailors, surfers and beachgoers. It might even make some of you think twice about heading out into the deeper waters. This is the case of the disappearing great white. It's not so much the disappearance itself that's mysterious, but more the circumstances in which it happened. Back in November of 2003, along the southwestern coast of Australia, Dave Riggs and his film crew were documenting a study of great white sharks, the largest predatory fish on Earth. The researching marine biologists had managed to tag a magnificent 9-foot female, which they decided to name Alpha. She was a strong and healthy adult shark, ideal for the study. Alpha was carefully tagged with a data logger and set loose once more. A data logger was the best option for collecting larger quantities of information over longer periods of time. The downside of using this particular tag was that it didn't provide wireless or GPS information, so it would have to be manually retrieved once the researchers had gathered enough information. Unfortunately, but even more fascinatingly, in this case, the researchers never got the chance to catch up with Alpha and retrieve the tag from her. 4 months later, the tag itself was found washed up on the beach by a passerby who recognised what it was and handed it in for examination. The data that was found on the logger was extraordinary, to say the least. The data clearly showed that Alpha the great white shark had suddenly experienced a sudden, sharp plunge down of over 1,900 feet, along with a rapid temperature rise. The researchers came to the conclusion that the rapid rise in temperature could only have been reached in the digestive system of a much larger animal. The data suggested that some kind of giant sea creature had suddenly consumed the 9-foot apex predator whole, before diving down deeply at high speed. Dave Riggs, the marine biologist leading the study, had this to say: "The internal temperature of the animal that ate the shark is a weird one. It appears to be too low for a killer whale, and too high for another shark, unless it was massive." Another more exotic theory is that out there somewhere is an actual sea monster which swam up and ate the shark before disappearing back into the deepest depths of the ocean. Many would argue the official theory of a giant megashark capable of swallowing big sharks whole could definitely be classed as an actual sea monster in its own right. Airliners are huge and expensive vehicles, so it's hard to imagine that one could be lost. However, that's exactly what happened to a Boeing 727, which belonged to a Miami-based aerospace sales and leasing company. The plane in question had been parked at Angola's 4 de Fevereiro airport for over a year, and in that time it had collected at least $4 million worth of unpaid airport fees. At around 5 PM on May 25, 2003, the 727 was taken by an American pilot and engineer named Ben Padilla and a Congolese mechanic named John Mutantu. Both men boarded the 727, which they had been working maintenance on for weeks. They then ignored calls from the airport's control tower, who noticed them moving the plane to a takeoff position. Despite the fact that neither one of them were actually qualified to fly the plane, they flew off into the sunset, never to be seen again. This was strange, not just because these men were trusted professionals, but the 727 usually requires a crew of 3. Could it be possible there was a third unknown person involved? Keeping in mind that this happened less than 2 years after the 9/11 tragedy, at a time when tensions were still very high, it's only natural that the first theory was the theft could be linked to a potential terror threat. Without evidence to believe otherwise, law enforcement and intelligence agencies began a frantic search for the missing 727, and wanted to know more about the men who took it. Strangely, to this day, or at least at the time of recording, not much is known about John Mutantu. As far as we're aware, there are no photos of him and no family statements in the media, which is very peculiar, whichever way you look at the situation. A missing man, guilty or innocent, would normally have images released to the press. In contrast to John Mutantu, there are multiple interviews and testimonials about Ben Padilla. His family describe him as someone who had always been interested in aeronautics since a young age. He was also said to have enjoyed working in distant locations, such as Southeast Asia, South America, and Africa. On the whole, most character profiles were very positive. However, one former employer said he was only interested in chasing local women and reported that he once left a hotel without paying the $10,000 bill. Ben Padilla's brother refuses to believe he took the plane voluntarily and thinks it was hijacked by terrorists. He also claims that he and Ben actually discussed the possibility of a hijacking, and Ben said he would choose to crash the plane rather than fly it anywhere against his will. Before being sold to the Miami-based aircraft agency, the plane was previously a passenger jet for American Airlines. It was still silver in colour and still had the blue, red and white stripes. Apart from that and the serial number, there was nothing distinctive about its exterior. Prior to being stolen, it was in the process of being repurposed to carry diesel to Angolan diamond mines. Most of the aircraft's interior had been removed to allow room for 10 500-gallon fuel tanks. If these tanks were full during some kind of attack, you can only imagine the destruction it would have caused. Despite intensive searches being undertaken by the CIA and FBI in locations such as Sri Lanka and Nigeria, no trace of the airliner was found. According to the Charlie Project, which is an organisation dedicated to cold cases, the 727 was last thought to be heading towards the Seychelles Islands. Other online sources claim it even requested landing permission, but never actually landed. One theory suggested that if it was a terror-related incident, the target could be the American bases in Diego Garcia, which is around 1,200 miles beyond the Seychelles. The problem with this theory is that 727s only have a flight range of 3,000 miles on a full tank, and Diego Garcia is just over 4,000 miles away from the 4 de Fevereiro airport. Also, it's accepted that the stolen 727 in question only had 2,000 miles worth of fuel left in the tank, limiting it to this radius. Eventually, the US authorities came to the conclusion that there was no terror connection, and the decision was made to scale down the investigation. At this point, people began to look deeper into the company that owned the plane, and came up with theories linked to insurance fraud. At the time of its disappearance, the plane was being leased to a man named Keith Irwin. Irwin had procured the aircraft in February 2002 from the Florida-based aerospace company, which was owned by a man named Maury Joseph. As we're already aware, the plane was going to be used for delivering diesel to diamond mines in Angola. Irwin only had the plane for a short time before he began missing payments. Joseph arranged for an Air Gemini crew to fly the 727 back on May 26, 2003. But as we already know, it had been stolen at this time. Investigators began to suspect that Maury Joseph had hired Ben Padilla and John Mutantu as part of an insurance scheme to recoup his losses. It was later revealed that Joseph had prior fraud charges against him. A few years earlier, the Securities and Exchange Commission had charged him with falsifying financial statements and defrauding investors. He was heavily fined and banned from serving as an officer in a publicly held company ever again. Naturally, this would raise suspicion, but Maury Joseph was quick to get in contact with the FBI and volunteered to take a lie detector test. He passed the test, removing any further suspicion against him. The case was seemingly well and truly cold, but then, in early November 2009, the wreckage of a 727 was discovered abandoned in the Saharan desert of Mali in West Africa. This was significant because it was one of the countries that fell within the 2,000-mile radius the plane could have possibly reached. At first, it was believed that the 727 had crash-landed, but a closer look revealed that a nearby prehistoric lakebed had been converted into a makeshift runway, and that the aircraft had landed there before being deliberately set ablaze. Answers about the origins of the wrecked 727 were delayed, since it turned out that the newly discovered 727 carried a false registration belonging to a Saudi Arabian airline. The real 727, with that registration, had been destroyed in an accident some time before. An international investigation linked the wrecked 727 to the trafficking of huge amounts of cash and narcotics between Colombia, West Africa, and Europe. According to a UN crime agency, after the plane's final journey, it was destroyed by the traffickers. Considering the fact that very few 727s are unaccounted for, the probabilities of the wreckage being the Angola 727, stolen 6 years earlier, are pretty high, but it's still not confirmed. The sad fact is that there is still no sign of Ben Padilla and John Mutantu. If they were involved in the theft, they could either be living out a wealthy retirement somewhere in the world, or they've been silenced. Either way, there's still no closure for their friends and families. What do you think really happened? On the 27th of December 2018, a 1,950-ton oil cargo ship named the Namse Bangdzod departed with 1 million litres of crude palm oil from the Indonesian port town of Sampit in central Kalimantan, heading for the port of Tanjung, Jakarta. On board were 11 crew members and their captain. Its arrival was expected just the following day, but on the 28th of December, communication was lost with the massive vessel. As the ship was sailing on a pre-planned route, the Indonesian Navy were able to establish that something must have gone wrong, since it had recorded unexpected changes in the position on multiple occasions via the ship's automatic tracking system. Even with this technology, the exact whereabouts of the ship were never fully established. After 3 days of searching, the National Search and Rescue Agency concluded that the disappearance of the tanker was, as they believe, likely to have been due to a pirate hijacking, which would explain the earlier changes in its route. They also added that since this was a matter of piracy, the search was no longer their responsibility. One of the last data inputs was tracked by officials on the 3rd of January 2019 at 9:42 AM, while the ship was somewhere in Ujang Karawang waters. Since this area was considered to be very safe, the Navy disagreed that the ship had been hijacked by pirates. Furthermore, they also added that there had been no demand for ransom for the cargo or the hostages. Theories regarding this response stated that just because the ship was travelling along a safe route doesn't mean it wasn't under pirate control. There are also theories that perhaps selling the valuable cargo could have been the objective, not a ransom. If this was the case, then the fate of the people on board looks even more unsettling. The Navy also stated that the ship had been recorded changing position several more times, moving from Jakarta Bay to Sunda Kelapa Port, but was never found or seen in either location. On January 6th, the ship was tracked again, this time with a course pattern that was described by the Marine Bulletin as being rather hectic and kind of confused, which would possibly suggest that it actually could have at that point been totally under pirate control, as they may not have had the necessary experience to handle the ship. In an interview with Wikinews Investigates, Dr. Tristan Smith of University College London, a shipping researcher, explained that crews may sometimes turn their trackers off deliberately to avoid being tracked for safety reasons, for example, in areas where piracy is high risk. Also, in the same article, Doug Miller of Miltech Marine, a firm specializing in the tracking technology used on the missing ship, explained that the transponder would broadcast automatically, as long as it had power and a functioning antenna, even if the crew were no longer on the ship. So what could this possibly mean? It seems like the ship was trying to avoid detection on some occasions, but then allowing themselves to broadcast a signal on others. Why would this be the case? It also seems to suggest that if pirates were responsible, they would likely have knowledge of the tracking systems. But still, why would they turn them back on at all? One possible theory is that the ship had its identity stolen, with the imposter vessel conducting maneuvers in various locations and turning the signal on and off, falsely transmitting information, identifying itself as the Namse Bangdzod. Meanwhile, the cargo of palm oil, which would eventually have expired, could have been sold on some kind of black market. The disappearance of the ship is one thing, but it also raises the important question as to what happened to the 11 crew members and their captain. What do you think happened?